Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, April 30th, 1994, 18-year-old American Michael Fay is in detention in Singapore, awaiting punishment after being convicted of vandalism. If you know or remember this story, you'll of course remember that his punishment, in addition to a fine, was corporal punishment, in this case, caning. And that is what made this case so explosive and controversial in the United States and around the world, and led to lots of diplomatic negotiations about whether Singapore would go forward with caning Michael Fay, and lots of conversations about different cultural approaches to punishment. So let's talk about that 1994 incident. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So this was a really fascinating story that wrapped in all sorts of bigger questions, as I said, about cultural differences and our appetite for punishment of different kinds. And there's some really fascinating stuff that I certainly had not remembered on that front. But on the specifics of the case, Michael Fay, he's an American kid. I don't know. And that's an interesting use of word there, actually. I'm curious because, that's a big part of it. He's 18 years old, but, he's a young American living in Singapore. And even by his own admission, commits some sort of light vandalism. But what are the specifics of the case? And then we'll get into kind of the way that it blew up into a controversy.
So this is worth rehearsing because I think in memory his violations have been contorted somewhat. But he was responsible for vandalizing some cars, stealing a road sign. He was doing things like egging the cars, maybe breaking out windows, things like that, and gets caught as part of a group of young people, teenagers who were going around and engaging in, vandalism, like property destruction, as part of their night out.
Yeah, it's so funny, too, because when I remember this story, I was always told that he, spit on the sidewalk or he threw gum on the sidewalk, that Singapore's really clean and, when you spit or throw out gum on the sidewalk, that this is the punishment. And for some reason, in my childhood mind, I completely missed that, no, he was actually cutting up. It was actually destroying property. It went a little bit further than just sort of throwing your gum out on the sidewalk. So I do think that is a helpful reminder, because while we might think of it as not as drastic, it was still destruction of property to some extent.
But there's an interesting element there of how I think I sort of probably misremembered it too. And for some reason, I had the spitting or the chewing gum was wrapped up in this story for me. But I think that's in large part because of the way that this turned into a larger story about Singapore and how, super harsh penalties are used to keep the city clean. And probably in some of the write-ups and op-eds and the chattering on cable news, people were referring to spitting and chewing gum as huge violations for which there are excessive punishments. And so that probably got conflated into here. But that's one specific thing, is that was not the actual charge. The charge was stealing road signs. He confessed or pleaded guilty to stealing road signs and vandalism, but then later he said he hadn't done the vandalism of cars and they'd only stolen road signs. And moreover, he said that kind of in those pleas, by admitting to doing these things, he was told that it would preclude caning, which of course it did not. He's detained, and word gets out that this will be his punishment. In addition to about a $2,000 fine, there were going to be 6 strokes of the cane as part of his punishment.
And 4 months in jail, right? 4 months in jail is no joke. I mean, all 3 of those, the fine, the caning, and the prison sentence are big deals. But taken all together, I think it's a lot for an 18-year-old to take in. There was a lot there.
And I think in the U.S., an 18-year-old prosecuted of these crimes could have expected at least that much time in jail and that much of a fine, depending on their socioeconomic status and race. But the caning becomes the central part of the story because it's, as people learn more about it, it's a trained martial arts person who carries out the caning. And it can be something that leaves lifelong injuries in addition to being very, very, very painful. And so that becomes, I think, the focus of whether or not this is abuse, whether or not this is cruel and unusual punishment, and how the U.S., not just like his parents, but how the U.S. government, including the president, should intervene in this case.
People are denouncing it as archaic and a leftover from colonialism, whereas others are kind of trying to frame it in terms of, well, this is a clash of Western values versus Asian values. And then there's this undercurrent, too, of like, well, Singapore is this sort of futuristic, super orderly, super clean city, and this is what it takes in order to pull that off. And so it's just kind of spinning in all sorts of different directions. I don't know if any of those threads are ones that you want to pick up. I mean, I am struck mostly by kind of this notion of like our values versus their values, which I think when you actually think about it, probably aren't that far apart.
That's
no, not at all. I mean, part of me is like, okay, maybe again, 19th century. I'm like, hello, whippings and floggings were so much the fabric of American culture for hundreds of years, like easily 200 years. Like the way that we think about crime and punishment in the United States is so intense and so violent. I think that, people in glass houses probably shouldn't throw stones. But, I mean, Americans seemed appalled by this. And you really don't have to go to a distant past at all in order to see how Americans have participated in the same sort of harsh punishment.
Or to the past at all. Not only is the U.S. a place where you have like solitary confinement and the death penalty, which many, many, many other countries criticize the U.S. for, but corporal punishment is still part of school in the United States. I think 48 states still allow it in private schools. 15 states still actively practice it in public schools. Like, there's a reason why, what was it? Something like 60% of Americans were like, yeah, maybe hit that kid with a stick.
Well, let's linger on that, because as much as we remember this story as one where Americans were up in arms about this cruel punishment, it is the case that a survey of 23,000 people from what is now Pew found that 60% of Americans, quote, favored whipping and other harsh sentences as an acceptable deterrent to crime in the United States. So, I don't know. That's a pretty big majority to get 60% on, and even Michael Fay is from Dayton, Ohio. There were surveys in his hometown and callers to a newspaper survey who said that they backed the caning nearly 2-1. And so I don't know what's at the heart of it there,
This has to be before. Like now I feel like there's a campaign where it's like, don't spank your kids.
Well, yes, that's a big part of this
too. Don't whoop your kids. Like, the whole idea of like, we're doing timeout. We're not doing, like physical punishment. But all throughout, American history, certain generations grew up with parents. It's like, if you get in trouble, you're getting a spanking, you're getting a pop-up, you're getting whatever you want to call it, the belt. Yeah. And I think people saw that as reasonable because it fit their own lived experiences of what happened when they acted out at home.
And as far as that statistic about wanting the whipping and harsher sentences, this is 1994. There's a crime bill being passed that is going to give harsher sentences, that is going to escalate the use of the death penalty, that is going to be this kind of bipartisan stiffening of the judicial system.
3 strikes, you're out.
Mm-hmm.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
But yeah, I think, Kellie, you're right. Throughout the 90s, there was a big conversation in parenting and, society-wide about that kind of punishment. And, I was struck by these stats, and I wonder behind those stats, there's probably a little bit of a, deference to somewhere else's rules. You break the rules in a country, you're going to face the consequences of that country. But I think more than anything, as we've been saying, at the heart of it is evidence that we have much greater appetite for punitive measures of this kind than I think we want to admit to ourselves.
I blame the Puritans. It all goes back to the Puritans.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, over time, like there's always that line where Americans decide, this kind of punishment is acceptable and this kind is not, but it's a moving line and it's a very blurry line, and things seem to arbitrarily move from one side to the other. And so the fact that like we say we're not okay with caning, but we are okay with electrocution, there doesn't seem to be a logic.
I will say though that at least in the United States, something for like, I don't know, taking down a sign or vandalism might come with a fine. It might come with some community service.
Yeah.
It's not going to come with 4 months of jail time to my mind.
Right.
But we have other things that are not as serious too that do come with serious penalty.
Well, this is the era of broken windows, right? This is the era of like in the US there's a conversation about you have to come down hard on these small things before they become big problems. And that is exactly what Singapore, in response to this, as this becomes a diplomatic issue, and Bill Clinton has to weigh in, but that is Singapore's response, and they issue an 8-page defense of the sentence, and they basically say, quote, "It is because of our tough laws against antisocial crimes that we do not have a situation like, say, in New York, where even police cars are not spared by vandals." And New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani is sitting there reading that and going, there might be a point here, right? So
America's mayor.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, God.
But anything else to say about how Clinton has to weigh in and about the diplomacy here? I think we have a sense of the sort of media firestorm, but it becomes an international diplomatic.
Clinton basically sort of pleads with them like, hey, listen, can you take this off of the table? And their response is that, well, we want to have a good relationship with the United States, so we'll take it down from, 6 strikings down to 4. But which is still, he's still getting caned at the end of the day. I mean, it's not like they took it off the table. They decreased the amount, and I realized that they also just don't beat you. They gave him Valium, they medicated him, they sort of like prepared him to take this. But it's still a humiliating praxis, even if you remove the violence. The fact that you are being sort of strapped into a contraption, and then your bare buttocks is being exposed while you are hit with a cane.
Yeah. And for Clinton, it's like it's all in this realm of international relations and media relations at home. Like Singapore is an ally. It's an important economic trading partner. And so there's only so far he can try to push it. And then you add in the United States questionable moral authority in this era. And that's what he can get. He can get two strikes taken away.
Yeah. Obviously, this continues to be something the U.S. has to weigh. I mean, certainly in the way that we've been describing about kind of how do we think of punishment and our appetite for punishment, but also on the international stage. I mean, we turn our eye away from what happens in all sorts of countries that we, need as partners. And we sometimes decide that something's over the line, and more often than not decide that, the diplomacy is worth it.
The irony is that, like, we just did this episode about Abu Ghraib, and it's like just the heinous, torturous acts. And then to, like, 10 years earlier say, like, oh, no, this is so barbaric. It's just like, I can't. The hypocrisy is too much.
Yeah. Yeah. All of this falls under that category of what's the phrase? Are we the baddies? Like we tell ourselves a story and then we might realize that we're, So Faye is caned on, as we said, May 5th, 1994. He comes back to the United States in that summer. He gives an interview on Larry King, and then he, doesn't really talk too much about it, doesn't detail his experience, and, I think he's back living in Ohio. One last little tidbit that struck my eye was that SNL around this time in 94 did a cold open skit of the caning of Michael Fay, and it's like, talk about something that just sort of evinces our capacity to be okay with this kind of stuff.
The Simpsons has an episode too where Bart Simpson gets a booting.
Oh yes, I remember that in Australia, right? And I, in my head, seem to remember that being a really, really excellent episode. That's the one with the toilet that goes the other way. Anyway,
Me too.
But yeah. All right. Well, we will leave it there. Really fascinating. And I guess, Kellie, to your point, between this and the previous episode, there's some some sort of parallels there for sure. But maybe I don't know what's coming up next, but hopefully something a little lighter.
We'll do an episode on like those fainting baby goats.
Unicorn?
Can we just go find a presidential pet or something, or some lovely thing that Jimmy Carter did? Anyway, okay. We will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
News: a Singapore court had sentenced an 18-year-old American to 6 strokes with a bamboo cane swept round the world.
It's the first I've heard of it. I'll look into it.
After President Clinton personally appealed for leniency, Singapore reduced the sentence from 6 lashes to 4. But that wasn't much consolation for Michael Fay.
Radiotopia.